We're going to make this mud material, which is a fairly complex material, but it looks really good. And you can see we've got this mud, but we've also got these sort of puddles mixed in. I'm going to start in an empty scene by adding a sphere. You can do that with Shift-A, Mesh, UV Sphere, and right-click it and Shade Smooth. And then I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier and turn up the levels a bit and just apply it so we have a fairly dense sphere. Next, in the Shading tab, I'm going to add an HDRI to our world so that we have some good lighting to test this material against. So just go into the World drop-down menu here in the Shading tab and hit Shift-A, Texture, Environment Texture, hook up an environment texture, and then load in an HDRI of your choice. If you don't have any HDRIs, you can download some for free from Polyhaven or any other places. And next, going into render view mode, you can see we have some nice lighting. Go back into object mode and let's get started on our mud. So select the sphere and hit new to create a new material. And then over here in the materials panel, I'm just going to rename this to mud. Hit Shift-A, texture, noise texture to add a noise texture. And then as long as you have the node wrangler enabled, you can use the shortcut Control-T or add a texture coordinate node and mapping node manually. Set the scale on the noise texture to 15 and the detail to something like 5 and the roughness all the way up to something like 1. And then out of this factor output, we're going to hit Shift-A and search for a color ramp and plug the factor into the input on the color ramp. Next, I'm just going to drag this black handle up about maybe a third of the way and drag this white handle down maybe about a third of the way as well. If you have the Node Wrangler plugin turned on, you can hit Control-Shift-Click to preview this color ramp. And essentially, this is the mask that we're going to use to blend between two colors to give us a good-looking mud. So next, let's add a mix node with Shift-A, Search, and Mix, and change it from float to color. Or if you're in an older version of Blender, you'll want to do Shift-A search for Mix RGB, but in newer versions of Blender, that's been replaced with the Mix node. Plug the color output from this color ramp into the factor on the Mix node. Then we're going to choose a couple of colors for our dirt, and we're going to choose for A, I ended up with a color of 1E1817. And for the second color, I ended up with 5A4C42. That's a very dark brown and a very light brown. And if you Control-Shift-Click this to preview this node, you can see that we've got a nice mix between the dark and light brown, and this will be a good base for our dirt. Now I'd like a slightly more complex color, so I'm actually going to select these three nodes and Shift-D to duplicate them down and plug the vector from our mapping node into the vector on this other noise texture. And I'm just going to reverse the handles on this color ramp so that the white is on the left and the black handle is somewhere around the middle. And then I'm going to change the scale on this second color ramp node to something like 25 and the detail to 2.9 and the roughness again we can leave at 1. And if you Control-Shift-Click this other color ramp, you can see this is a different mask from the first mask we created, and now we can mix these two different groups of color mix nodes together. So let's set some different colors on our second mix node. For a dark brown, I settled on 292120. And then for a lighter brown, I settled on 79624A. Now let's duplicate this mix node with Shift-D one more time and mix the results of these two colors into A and B with a factor of 0.5. And now if we Control-Shift-Click to preview this, we can see we've got a little more complex looking mud. So that's our base color. Let's go ahead and plug that into the base color on the principled BSDF and preview that. That's good. Now let's go ahead and make our roughness map. To do that, we're going to use this same output, and we're just going to plug it into a color ramp to create a map. Take the output of this mixed result and plug it into the factor, and then we're going to drag the white handle all the way down here to somewhere around here. And then for the left handle here, which is normally black, I'm going to change the color to a lightish gray, something like 494949. Then go ahead and plug this color output into the roughness. Now that's pretty good, but it needs some depth, so we're going to add a bump map. So hit Shift A, search for bump, and to make our bump map, we're just going to actually take the color output of this roughness map and plug it directly into the height, and plug the normal output into the normal. And this is a little strong, so I'm going to turn it down to a value of maybe something like 0.05. Now this is a good dirt material for our mud, and we'll make it a little more realistic later with some displacement. But for now, we need to start work on the puddles. Now to make the puddles, we can add a Musgrave texture. So hit Shift A, search Musgrave texture. And I'm going to plug the vector from this mapping node into the vector input on the Musgrave texture as well. And just move this down here. And if you Control Shift click, you can preview this Musgrave texture. And that's okay, but it's not quite what we're looking for puddles. So I'm going to change the scale to something like 4, reduce the detail to something like 5, so the puddles are a bit more smooth. So this whole material up here is our dirt. Now let's make a material for our puddles, and to do that we're going to duplicate the principled BSDF and just make a copy down here. And we're going to use this Musgrave texture to mix sort of between two different colors for the puddles. So I'm going to add a color ramp after the Musgrave, and I'm just going to drag this position down on the white handle to something like somewhere around 0.3-ish is fine. And what that's doing is just increasing the contrast of this map a little bit. Next we can add a mix node, and we're going to mix between two colors for our puddles. So let's add a mix node and change it to color. And for the first color, I settled on a color of B9ADAF. And for the second color, I settled on 5A4E3D. These, by the way, are colors that I sampled from a reference image. Now let's take the color output of our color ramp and plug it into the factor of our mix node. And this is going to become the base color for our puddles. So let's plug the result into the base color. And if you Control Shift click, we can preview this principled BSDF node. Now let's go ahead and turn the roughness all the way down to 0 because we want our puddles to be reflective. And what this color ramp here does beside our Musgrave texture is essentially, you can see it's increasing or decreasing the contrast of this blend between our puddle colors. And what we want is a scenario where we have sort of this darker brownish color for the deep areas of the puddle, but then this light color sort of just around the edges of the puddles. Now this is looking okay. If we Control Shift click between this and this, but now we need to blend these two together, and to do that we need to create a mask. So we're going to go Shift A, and we're going to search for a mix shader node, and we're going to use that to combine the puddles and our dirt. So let's plug our dirt material into the first shader slot here, and our puddle material into the second one. And then for our mask, we can actually reuse our Musgrave texture because this defines where the puddle colors are. So what we can do is we can take the height output of our Musgrave texture and plug it into the mix shader. And if I Control Shift click this mix shader, you can see this is the mix that we are currently getting. And that's okay, but I'd like to change the contrast a little bit just for this mix. So I'm going to again search for a color ramp, Shift A, search color ramp, and I'm going to drop it here just above this other color ramp so that we have two color ramps coming out of our Musgrave. And I'm going to drag this black handle up to a position of about 1.35. So you can see this is just restricting a little bit those highlighted edges. And I'm going to bring down this other handle here to a position of somewhere around 0.45 should be fine. And you can see now that we have very clearly defined puddles and brightish edges. Now this is still looking pretty flat, and so the last thing that we need to do is we need to make a displacement map. And what we'd like to do is to displace the areas where we have dirt, but we want the puddles to remain completely flat. And so we're going to have to subtract the puddle areas from the displacement map that we're going to use to displace the surface wherever there is mud. Now that won't be hard to do because we already have this color ramp here, which is clearly defining the areas where there are puddles and where there are no puddles. So what we need to do first is to create a displacement map that we can use to displace the areas where there are dirt. So let's go ahead and do that down here. So I'm going to go Shift A search and add a noise texture. And we can just move this mapping node down because I want to plug that vector into the vector for this noise texture. And I'm going to duplicate this noise texture down 3 times and plug our mapping vector into all 3. On this first noise texture, I'm going to set the scale to 30, the detail to 5, and the roughness to 0.8, and the distortion to 0.1. And if I Control Shift click, that's what this looks like. On this second texture, I'm going to set the scale to 25, the detail to something arbitrarily high, 5 or 10. I don't think it makes much difference once it's past a certain point. And I'm going to turn the roughness down all the way to something like 0. And you can see we've got one that's more sharp and detailed and one that's a little bit more sort of lumpy and smooth. I'm going to add a color ramp again to boost the contrast a little bit on this top noise texture. So let's go ahead and plug the factor into the factor on the color ramp. And I'm just going to drag this black handle up so you can see we have something that's much more contrasty. And then I want to mix these two together. And so we can do that again with a mix node and change the mode to color. And I'm going to plug the color output from this color ramp and the color output from this noise texture here. And if I Control Shift click, it's a little hard to see because this is a color output, but I'm going to turn the factor down a little bit to something like 0.4, which is going to give us more of that sort of sharper blend and a little bit less of this very sort of smooth, lumpy blend. Finally, for this last noise texture, I'm going to set the scale to something like 12.5 and the detail at 0. And the roughness, I'm going to again turn that all the way down to 0. And the distortion, I can turn that to 0.1. So this again is a sort of smooth, lumpy mask here. But what we're going to do is we are going to add this in to this mix here. And that way we've got sort of a couple of different sizes of this noise so that it's not too uniform all over the surface. So let's duplicate this second mix node here, and I'm going to change the mode from mix to add, and then I'm going to plug this result into A, and I'm going to plug this result into B. And then we can turn the factor all the way up to 1. And it looks something like this. Great, now let's turn this into a pretty contrasty mask. We can do that by duplicating this color ramp and plugging the result into the factor here. And again, if I Control Shift click, you can see this is where we're going to have displacement on the object. And I'm just going to drag the black handle up to a position of around 0.65, 0.6, something like that. And essentially anywhere that's more black is going to go down, and anywhere that's more white is going to go up. I think 0.6 is a good value for this, or 0.62, something like that is fine. Great, so now we have our displacement map. So let's go ahead and make this displace. So Shift A, search add, and search for displacement. And we're going to plug that color output into the height, and then we're going to plug that displacement into the displacement on our material output. And if we preview our mix shader, you can see this is looking a lot more like mud than it was before, but we still have some issues. So to start with, let's go ahead and change the mid-level to 0, and let's go ahead and reduce the scale to something like 0.05. And you'll notice that it still looks flat, and that's because we need to go into the material settings here over on the right-hand side and change it from under surface settings, surface displacement from bump only to displacement and bump. And now you can see that our sphere is actually displacing. Now in the areas where we have mud, this looks really good, but we're still getting displacement on the areas where we have that puddle material. And if you remember from earlier, it's because we needed to subtract our puddle mask from this height map so that we're not getting any displacement there. So let's go ahead and do that. So add another mix node. I'm just going to duplicate one here, and then we're going to change the mode from mix to subtract. And we're going to change the factor all the way to 1. So we have this color ramp up here that we created earlier, which is a contrasty mask of our puddle areas. So let's take that and plug it into B on this subtract node. And then we'll take this noise map here and plug it into A. And if you control shift click on this subtract node, you should see that we still have our displacement everywhere that we want it, but now the areas where there are puddles are pretty much completely black. So now let's take this subtract node and take this result and plug it into our height input for our displacement node. And just to keep things nice and clean, I'm going to label these so we can do that with frames. So I'm going to highlight this down here and hit Control J and select the frame and hit F2 just to rename it. And this is our displacement map. And then up here in the middle, this was our puddle map. So I'll Control J and F2 to rename this puddles for our puddle material. And then up here in the top, I'm going to hit Control J and F2 to rename this to soil or mud. Let's maybe call it mud. There we go. And we can Control Shift click on the mix shader to go back to here. And in previewing the mix shader, one thing I forgot to mention here is that we need to do one more thing, because you'll notice that it's not actually properly subtracting this from the displacement map, and that's because we need to clamp this result. So go ahead and turn on clamp result, and your puddles should become flat. Cool, that's great. Now I'm going to do one other thing here, and that is that I'm going to turn this into a node group so that our mud is very easy to use. So I'll go ahead and highlight everything and hit Control G to group this, and then tab to exit. And you can hit F2 to rename it to something like mud, and tab to re-enter the group. And I'm just going to, under the, where is it? Under group outputs, I'm going to move the shader output up to the top since those were reversed. So tab to exit the group. And that's it. That is our realistic mud surface. One thing I want to mention as well is that this is a very noisy material. And if you go into the output settings, one thing I wanted to highlight is that under render, I'm actually rendering this at 512 samples with denoising turned on. And the reason for that is just because this is a very noisy material. And it has to be that way because mud, if you look at some reference images of mud, sort of mud puddles like this, the sort of dirt areas are very noisy, and that's what sort of gives it the realistic looking appearance. In any case, that's all I have for you right now, so I hope this was helpful. And if you'd like to see more content like this, then, like, subscribe, leave a comment. It helps the channel out, and I'll know that this is a type of content that I should be making more of.